Hi, this is Danielle. I have some very sad news if you have not already heard. Guy Haynes was kind enough to send me a text to let me know that Catherine Lee Scott posted on her Facebook page that her dear friend Lara Parker, who of course played Angelique, passed away on Thursday, October 12th. I'm heartbroken to hear this news. Lara's portrayal of Angelique was a huge part of many of our childhoods and has stayed with me all these years. I did not know Lara personally. I met her once briefly at a Dark Shadows festival, and I had the good fortune to interview her on this podcast last year, and she was wonderful. Her thoughts and the thoughts she shared were insightful, intelligent, and she stayed on after the episode and chatted with me in the Zoom. She continued to talk with me. We talked about teaching and kind of commiserated over teaching college and grading essays. And she asked me about what's this Penny Dreadful stuff all about? You know, she was asking me questions about the podcast. I just remember after I hung up, I posted this on Facebook. My first thought was, wow, she's so cool. She really was. So I want to express my deepest sympathies to Lara's family, her many friends, including her Dark Shadows castmates, and her legions of fans. Please bear in mind that this episode you're about to hear with Stuart Manning was recorded, about a week and a half ago at this point. I'm recording this on October 16th right now, so please bear that in mind going into this show. Welcome to Terror at Collinwood. In just a couple of minutes, you'll be hearing from my guest today, Stuart Manning, returning to the podcast to talk about the groovy new issue of Daytime Gothic. But before we get to that, I have a little bit of news for you. A reminder, Catherine Lee Scott and Marie Wallace will be appearing at Lyndhurst on October 21st and 22nd. And they're going to be doing a meet and greet twice on Saturday, twice on Sunday, 10:30 a.m., 1 p.m., both days, and you don't want to miss that. Twinge of fear and tears that glisten. There are spoilers here for those who listen. Welcome to Terror at Collinwood. I am your hostess, Danielle, aka Penny Dreadful, and I am really excited to welcome my guest back to the podcast. He's back with a new issue of Daytime Gothic. I am speaking, of course, of Stuart Manning, who is the editor and publisher of the gorgeous charity fanzine Daytime Gothic and the exciting upcoming Daytime Gothic issue 2. Stuart, of course, published the popular UK Dark Shadows journal zine and ran the Dark Shadows news page for many years, and he continues to run it through its current iteration through social media. Stuart has also worked on a number of official Dark Shadows projects as writer on Dynamite Comics and writer and producer on several Dark Shadows Big Finish audio dramas. Welcome back, Stuart.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm all right. I'm kind of bemused to be back doing this in all senses, but yeah, it's fun. We made it.
Great. You know what? I was telling you right before we started recording, all I've been hearing since that Daytime Gothic issue 1 came out is just positive reviews and raves. I bought an extra copy and sent it to my friend Eric, who loved it too. And I just had Danny Horn on the podcast, who wrote a piece for the first issue, and he's excited to be back for issue 2. And everybody's just raves about this, so it's great that you're bringing this back. Let's first, I want to ask you before we get into this. You mentioned to me over email that you're currently accepting submissions and that you're particularly looking for fan art and fan fiction. So can you talk a little bit about what you're looking for and what the deadline is for the submissions?
Yeah, well, the sort of deadline's probably going to be, I would say, late November, early December. And there's a lot of features lined up. There's things I've been working on. There's things I'm working on with other writers, you being one of them. Uh, but yeah, I think in terms of specifics, certainly I think we could use a little bit more fiction. So I'm interested in hearing from people who might have ideas in that area, and artwork too, because the last one we were very lucky. Jim Pearson at Dan Curtis Productions sort of opened his vaults and found some nice stuff. But I'd like to sort of try and do something that's a little more of an illustrated experience. Who knows? Maybe we'll achieve that. Maybe we won't. But I'd like to give it a go. So I'd certainly be interested in hearing from fan artists, and yeah, the more the merrier. And also, if you have a good features idea, it's an open. My door is open.
Wonderful. There are some fantastic fan artists out there and fanfic writers too. Some who were active back in the old school fanzine days and are still active, and I'm sure could submit some interesting pieces to you. Where can you send the?
You can email me at collinwood80@gmail.com, and I can send you. There's a sort of guideline document that just explains in more specifics pointers and format and word counts and things like that. But I'm interested in having a conversation with anyone who has an idea and wants to talk. And certainly some really good stuff has come that way.
Mm-hmm. I'm hoping that by the end of this week you can give us a little teases of what we can maybe expect. But issue 1, I mean, it was a big success. So it was a charity zine, and how much money was raised for Macmillan Cancer UK from this first issue?
So we ended up doing 2 printings. There was the initial big printing, then we did a smaller one that was more done to let people who'd missed out get it. So the yield on that wasn't great because it was a much smaller run. But in all, it ended up being just over $1,000, and it would have been a bit higher if we had a post increase halfway through. So the run fell a bit awkwardly. But I think that was a pretty respectable return, and certainly it was a good cause, and I know they appreciated it, and I'd hope this time round we could do a little bit higher.
Is it going to be the same charity for this issue?
No, we're doing partnership. There's a partnership with one of the Dark Shadows actors who's working on something quite special, and so there'll be. In due course, we'll announce a charity with them, and I think it's probably going to be split with one other to be decided. But that's probably also going to be a cast member.
Oh, wonderful. Good. It's great that cast members are enthusiastic about this and involved. In the first issue, you had a wonderful, heartfelt article by Catherine Lee Scott about her friend Mitchell Ryan, the late, great Mitchell Ryan.
Yeah, that was terrific. I was really, really pleased with that. I think it's just a gorgeous piece of writing.
Oh, yeah. And you had a couple of great pieces too. We had one by Lara Parker, a day at the studio, where she broke it down and what that was like. An interview with Nancy Barrett, a rare interview with Nancy Barrett, because she doesn't do a whole lot of those, but that was really cool. Can we expect more actor involvement in terms of articles and interviews and issues?
Yeah, a little bit. There's a couple of things. I mean, I'm sort of interested in trying to find different ways to involve people. Mm-hmm. So one of my reasons for doing a second issue is there was one idea I had after the first one was done that it's a kind of actor collaboration that I don't think's really been done before. And I sort of told myself, if we could pull that off, that would be a good enough reason to do a second issue. And I was kind of pleasantly surprised there was an awful lot of goodwill to make something that was a little bit complicated happen. And I think that will be really special. Mm-hmm. In due course, it'll be pretty obvious what that feature is, but I'm really pleased with that. It's a very sort of magazine thing that I hope people will get to take away something special from. And I sort of, I think we're kind of interested. It's interesting, the relationship, certainly compared to way back when I was doing this stuff. I think the relationship between the actors and the fans has shifted appreciably. I think it's a much more collegiate
Hmm.
It's a closer relationship, certainly, and it's really nice that people are enthusiastic and very generous with their time, and actually, yeah,
Hmm.
very accessible. And so, yeah, that's so there'll be some good actor input, which I think is really interesting. There's something else I'm working on, a couple of things I'm working on that will also hopefully involve some other actors as well. So I think there might be maybe half a dozen people
Hmm.
involved in different ways. And that's the other thing too, is I'm sort of one of the things I was trying to do in the previous issue, I think worked relatively well, was trying to find different ways to involve actors, because in some cases I've interviewed some of these people maybe half a dozen times, and
Sure.
you really probably not got much left to say to each other in terms of a standard interview. But for instance, getting Lara to talk for a studio day, that was just even though it's the most obvious magazine idea, A Day in the Life is the most obvious magazine format in the book. I'd never really seen it done for Dark Shadows, and I'd never seen the day and the actual sort of granular detail of making those shows broke down in that way. And Lara was really receptive, and I think really got it and sort of got the human interest angle. So that I was very pleased with.
Yeah.
And likewise, Catherine, who wrote her piece on Mitch Ryan, which I mean, it was sad circumstances, but I think she was uniquely placed to pay tribute to Mitch in a way that a straightforward obit feature really wouldn't have done. So yeah, that's an interesting aspect. It's sort of interesting to be sort of dealing with actors much more as a sort of commissioning editor rather than sort of straightforward interviews, which would have been the way things were done in the past.
Sure. But it's been done so much that it's great that you're finding new angles and new ways to include these people and to tell their stories. And I find that to be a challenge as well with interviews on the podcast. Because I'm like, what am I going to ask them that they haven't been asked 100 times before, that they haven't been asked on the MPI interviews? And that is a challenge. But you've successfully involved them in various ways so that people can see different angles, different sides of things. I've never seen a full breakdown of the day as told by an actor before. So that was fascinating. And you did mention to me privately the issue 2 piece that you were referencing, and I've never seen that done before either. So that's going to be pretty exciting, I think, for people to see that. You also interviewed Matt Hall, a really substantial interview with Matthew Hall, which was really cool and really nice to hear from him as well.
Yeah, that was great. I really liked that piece. Matt was really interesting guy, and I liked it was the kind of that's sort of there's a nice thing you can do in long form interviews. I'm sure you find it with your podcast as well.
Mm.
The having the space to talk beyond the obvious things. So the stuff I really liked in that interview was the Grayson's cooking,
Yes.
all of that sort of domestic detail. I think is at this point I think is much more interesting and much more illuminating, and makes her come to life as a person again in a way that we can watch the episodes. You can. I think we. Although they're obviously still interesting, I'm not sure they're illuminating at this point in that way, because I think we've all formed our opinions of them. Whereas, yeah, I loved hearing about Grayson's cordon bleu cooking courses that weren't finished and all of that stuff.
Right. And his also about his father, Sam Hall, and how, we had always heard the story that Sam had suggested to Dan Curtis that they kill off Julia, and Dan refused to do that. But it was interesting hearing Matthew Hall's angle on that, and your question of like, how do you think that would have gone down at home? So it's provided some interesting insights.
No, absolutely. So yeah, I'm kind of the interview aspect is interesting at this point, because having not really done nowadays, I do quite a lot of interviews for sort of journalism pieces for other shows, and I think I don't think I am, immodestly, I'm a better interviewer at this point just because I've done it a lot more. I'm not, so I think, and I've also got more of an opinion on what I think makes a good interview, the kind of things I want to hear from these people. So yeah, it's been interesting to redo that, and there's an interview I'm hoping will come off that. I'm going to make it happen. I think that will be an interesting conversation. A lot of it is sort of finding someone you think will be receptive to a certain type of discussion. And then if you're lucky, that's the conversation you get back. So, for instance, Nancy Barrett, who was, for various reasons, took a long time to tee up, but I really felt that it needed a big interview to anchor it, and she was just the person I wanted. I just felt she had the right position in terms of her tenure on the show. She's the only person we have who spans the entire run. There's no one else left at this point. She's also, I'd read other interviews of her and I sort of liked her. I liked her take on things. I thought she had a sort of, there was a perceptive quality that I thought would give some interesting stuff. And that was a really good conversation. It was definitely worth hanging on to make happen. So,
absolutely. Yeah.
So yeah, that's all of that I think that's definitely been an interesting aspect of revisiting doing a Dark Shadows publication for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, we've been talking about interviews, but there are so much more beyond the interviews. You had a lot of great articles in there about Dark Shadows. For example, I loved Ansel Farage's article about classic horror cinema that may have influenced Dark Shadows storylines. Ansel, of course, is very, immersed in that world. So he had some really great movies that he called out there. Although I did message him, I said, I think Plague of the Zombies was a stronger influence on Dark Shadows zombies than Night of the Living Dead, because Plague of the Zombies came out in 66, and it was more like the traditional voodoo zombies and gothic horror film. But I love that he called out Cabinet of Dr. Caligari too, which I hadn't thought of before for the Quentin zombie, because he does kind of look like Cesare when he's carrying Rachel Drummond in the mist and everything.
And yeah, that was another thing I really wanted to do with the features, which was to without being too didactic or sort of trying to patronizingly educate people, but to sort of look outwards from Dark Shadows and use Dark Shadows as a springboard to talk about other things, which I think sometimes there's a danger. There's a danger with the stuff, if you're going to do a whole magazine talking about one TV show, and Dark Shadows is a broad church, there's an awful lot of aspects one can talk about. But if everything looks inward, I think it reveals less. I think actually the more so for instance, going back to interviews, one of the reasons I really wanted a human interest aspect is because I think if you understand people in their workplace, you understand their work better, you understand how they were operating, and likewise to place Dark Shadows within a creative lineage or heritage. Apart from, I think you can come away with a new appreciation of the episodes. I hope it encouraged people to check out some of those films. I've checked out a few of them and got stuff out of them. And again, I just think it just, hopefully it deepens people's interests.
Absolutely, yeah. And speaking of human interest, you also had Mary O'Leary write a piece about Jonathan Frid, which was really great too.
The whole Jonathan Frid thing was kind of interesting because it was, that was literally a feature we couldn't have done back in the day.
Definitely not.
It was hung on. It really was centered on Jonathan's sexuality, which was not. Well, I guess it was probably open knowledge. It wasn't on the record, and I felt there was a space to. I hadn't read something that I felt was a really good response to that documentary, in sense of not that it needed the final word on it, but I think just to take it beyond Jonathan's life and actually place that within our understanding of Barnabas as a character and how that informs him. And I thought Joy Robinson, who wrote it, did a really good job of that, and her own take on it. But also, I think really went into the episodes in an interesting way and touched on other Dark Shadows cast members, and then Mary's piece was interviewing Mary was a really nice counterpoint to that, to give a direct, someone who actually knew Jonathan. So that was a really interesting piece, and I was really pleased to do that because it did feel, it felt like, it's not, I wouldn't say it's a radical piece or anything particularly contentious, but it's just something that wouldn't have been possible, say, 10 years ago.
Right, exactly. Yeah, you never would have seen something like that in the old fanzine days. I'm glad you brought back the print fanzine, not only because it's a gorgeous zine, but it includes content like that we wouldn't have seen before, and new takes on things. And I will give a shout out, my friend Rachel Freitas, who longtime listeners, I've heard her in episode 3 talking about Laura the Phoenix. She wrote the comparison between Dark Shadows and Port Charles, and she was absolutely ecstatic that was published in the zine. That was her dream article. She always wanted to write a piece about Dark Shadows and Port Charles, and she did a great job on that too.
Again, that was sort of interesting in a sense because I'd heard of Port Charles, but it was shown here, so I didn't have any other than knowing it was a thing that had happened for a bit and then went off the air. I didn't really know anything about it, but I thought that was interesting as a kind of case study. Could you do a modern Dark Shadows? And there was briefly around that time some interest from Fox Daytime about doing Dark Shadows, the daytime soap, which didn't really go anywhere. I don't think it really ever went further than the barest of discussion. But that's a possible window into how it might have fared and how it might have had to operate in the marketplace at that time. So that just felt. Again, it's something that I couldn't have done 10 years ago. Well, certainly not when I was doing the original fanzine. So that was, again, it was, those are the sort of things you're looking for because they're a reason to actually sort of hop back on the bus.
One thing that piqued my interest years ago that I read, in addition to that Fox Daytime pitch, the animated HBO Dark Shadows for adults, that like the night. Do you know anything about that? Because that was referenced in one of the Pomegranate books.
Other than that it was in consideration, there was also, there were lots of. The strange thing is, even though obviously really nothing came of pretty much any of them, there was a continual trickle of interest to do Dark Shadows in some form. Fremantle, who they're big in the soaps business in Europe and Australia, particularly. They investigated Dark Shadows for a time in the early noughts or late 90s. I forget when it was. There was the idea of doing a syndicated series in Canada that I think Manny Koto, who died recently, the Star Trek guy, was involved in, did some development on. So there was. It's kind of interesting that it almost feels inevitable that it would resurface at some point, just because if it's part of the conversation for that long, then that probably means eventually something will stick.
Right. Speaking of which, great segue, because you had a really nice piece by Mark B. Perry about Dark Shadows Reincarnation and his pitch. It was very compelling. And Mark is back at, now that the writer's strike is over, Mark is posting again about continuing his quest to bring the Dark Shadows, the Next Generation series here to television streaming. So I'm excited about the possibilities there.
Who knows? Maybe its time will come.
Maybe so. You also had some great fan fiction by Laramie Dean, the delightful Laramie Dean, who I've had on this podcast, and he is a trip. He's a lot of fun, and he wrote a really great piece about. We talked about it when he was on here. The many Angeliques, the many versions of Angelique. Great fiction.
Yeah, that was fun. I think I can't remember how that came about. I think I'd sort of mentioned to him that I'd been interested in this idea that because of a fluke in the continuity, there are clearly two Angeliques living in the present day concurrently. That he could do something with that, and he just went away and ran with it, and it was great, and that was great fun. And he's written a piece for the new issue, which is
good.
So spiky and offbeat, and I think very enjoyable. Although it's going to be a challenge to illustrate because it's got a sort of it's got a nice twist, and it'll be interesting to see how you illustrate that and don't give it away.
Okay. Oh, interesting. Interesting. I was talking to Laramie when he was here. I don't know if you know Donald F. Glut, Don Glut. He worked for Gold Key, did the Occult Files of Dr. Spectre, and then he wrote the novelization for The Empire Strikes Back. He's done a lot of, written a lot. He's a writer, wrote for a lot of animated Transformers and all that kind of thing. And he wrote a book called The Dracula Book, and he recently reissued it with additional material. And he's a big Dark Shadows fan. And he wrote an article about Angelique and his theory on Angelique's timeline. And it did involve two Angeliques existing at the same time. So it makes sense. it does, because her timeline certainly doesn't make sense. So
yeah, that was good fun.
Yeah. I also really enjoy it's a lot of fun humor in the issue, and that's something I always loved about the fanzines. Is they had some really serious, like the Warnots and type articles that were great, and I love those essays. And you had the fan fiction, but there was also some humor in the mix, and that's always fun to see. The cartoons by Sherlock back in the world of Dark Shadows and things like that. And I love that you included things like that. I definitely want to join Quentin Collins' Groovy Werewolf Club. I'm waiting for my membership card to arrive. Do you do you actually like become a werewolf, or are you just part of the like cheerleading Quentin's werewolf activities? I don't know.
I think you strangle your nearest and dearest.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean the humor. I mean that's sort of. I kind of a lot of those pieces were actually the first things done, because it's quite easy to kind of think of a dumb gag and just put together a page around it. Yeah. So I quite like those things. I like. And I think I like the variety of them as well. And I think they give you license that you can be quite earnest and in depth about other things, because then you'll turn the page and there's something that's a little oasis of silly
counterbalance. Yeah, nice. I love the gold key. I'm not the gold key. The Dan Ross satire. Oh my God, that was just spot on. Nailed it.
But again, those kind of things. The thing I like about, again, with those, I think you can uniquely do with a magazine. Good magazines are like being part of a club. It's about being with like-minded individuals. And even if you don't entirely get the references, I think you get the shape of the joke. So, and I kind of, I like the specificity of them. I think the more specific and idiosyncratic you go, the funnier it is. And hopefully we'll find some more pieces like that.
Yeah, hopefully so. I love the also the comic that was done in like an Edward Gorey style. I hope to see more cool artwork like that. And
that
stories.
Was great. Yeah, that was Brett Hurtholz, who he had done years and years ago. He did a comic adaptation on his blog of just a few pages of The Night Whispers, which was a Big Finish script I'd written. And he did it in that style, and it stuck in my mind. And we're friends on Facebook, and I sort of said to him, "Would you be interested in doing comic strip?" Just thinking about that, and I wasn't sure what it should be. And he said, "Oh yeah, absolutely." And so I sort of said to him, "Well, what characters do you want to draw?" And he gave me Roger, Maggie, Nicholas, and Barnabas. And so I sort of dashed off a funny idea, and he fleshed it out and did a lovely job with it. But yeah, I like the idea that it's just you can play with form, and I think it's good to go. You might hopscotch from an essay to an interview to something more discursive to something silly to a comic strip to a prose story.
Or Madeline's Lego Dark Shadows.
Yeah, something like that, which is just I think there's a sort of series of unexpected things, and I put a lot of work into ordering and reordering the pages, because I wanted those gear changes to be hopefully as surprising and offbeat and charming as you can make them.
Yeah, and it was exciting to see some familiar names in there. Podcast listeners that I've hear from here, Carol Sardo and Patty Karapinar, who did the great Julia medallion. She sent me one of those in the mail, and it's gorgeous. She's brilliant. Lots of really really cool things that I'm also thrilled that you're heading this up, because your graphic design work, in addition to your writing, is really sensational and really compelling and beautiful to look at. Just when you released that image for issue 2, I said, "Oh God, that is beautiful. I hope you use that for the cover of the
it's going to be the cover. I'll send you something later that it's been adapted a little, but you can tell me what you think. I've got another idea to how I'm going to use it, but." Yeah, the covers are sort of interesting, because I was very fortunate. I mean, Jim Pearson was really helpful with photography. Was very happy to give me more or less anything I wanted, which is great, obviously. But I wanted to use the photography a little bit differently, so quite specifically didn't use narrative shots, what we call episodics, which is scenes being played out. So what I wanted was stuff that either showed a behind the scenes aspect, or was a kind of what you call a setup. So like the cover shot where it's a posed scene that doesn't exist, but is sort of meant to galvanize what the show is about. And I think because they have their own sort of ambience and they're sort of Dark Shadows times 10.
Mhm.
I thought that was the sort of way to go with the photography. And one of the things I did that was, again, I thought was kind of cute was to find out the dates all these pictures were taken. And so pretty much all the captions had the day of the week and when it was, which again is a little wrinkle, but I think it sort of anchors things to a time and a place much more.
Yeah. And Rob Saccone, whose uncle was a cameraman on Dark Shadows, he also shared some of his pictures, which I'm thrilled to this day that his uncle was, gave him
Which
those.
contain a mystery.
Yeah.
I noticed when I was looking at the dates. Donna Wandry's in the back of one of them, or appears to be.
Yes. My guess
But
is she
it's
just
after
came.
she left the show. But the interesting thing is, it's the end of the year. I think it's either just before Christmas. No, it's not. It's the 30th. It's something like the 30th or the 31st.
Mhm.
And it was the last taping of the year. And I wonder if there was some gathering or something going on that day, and that's the reason she's there at the studio. But
Yeah.
it's after she's left the show. So
Mhm.
interesting.
I mean, who knows? I believe Jay Nass was, I think it's Jay Nass, the studio kid who took a lot of photos. He was there that day and he has pictures of her in that outfit on that day doing other things, like in one of the bedrooms, standing by the bed and stuff. Maybe she just came to visit. Who knows?
Who knows? Maybe she came to collect something. But yes, it's after she left the show. So that's a mystery.
Or maybe she wanted to learn a little bit about the behind the how to things work from it. I should have asked her.
Hustling for work in the new year. Who knows?
I should have asked her. I interviewed Donna Wandry recently. I was at Seaview Terrace and she was there and I interviewed her, but I'm sure she wouldn't remember. Like, why were you there that one day 50 plus years ago?
Who knows?
Who knows? Who knows?
But yeah, those pictures are terrific. I really like the just the. I think they sort of capture the ambience of the studio wonderfully. So they were great. They were terrific.
It's just incredible that things continue to turn up all these decades later, new things that we hadn't seen before. It's always exciting when that happens. So you not only design this beautiful zine, but you also, I hesitate to call it a zine because it's like a book, but you also wrote some wonderful things in here, including a great piece about the Leviathans, the place where Dark Shadows bent the knee to the fans, and it was all over from there. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, that was a little bit of a parlor game, really, as a way of. I mean, I'm not sure a single episode can really break a soap, but I think it is a really interesting turning point, and it's kind of. I find it sort of fascinating that the Dark Shadows was this sort of evolving thing that I don't think anyone was in control of, including the people who, in theory, thought they were in charge, and it's sort of. It's almost like a gambler's mentality. You know, Dan rolls the dice, and Curtis, the creator, rolls the dice 2 or 3 times and reinvents the show. And there's no reason why suddenly making it sci-fi should have worked. But the audience collectively just seemed they weren't buying it. And it's kind of really I think it's really, really interesting because it is sort of like a lucky streak. Once you lose it and you lose your nerve, it's kind of over. So yeah, that was kind of an interesting way of exploring some of the ways in which the show was put together and run, and possibly to its detriment and also to its benefit at times.
Absolutely, yeah. They did listen a lot to what the fans liked, even his own daughters, who they thought was cool and wasn't cool, and all of this. So, just the very idea of doing H.P. Lovecraft on daytime television is in 1969, 1970 is bananas. I just the thought of doing it. And I'm sure it was difficult. I mean, Dan was an enthusiast. He liked that stuff, but I'm sure it was probably challenging for, Sam Hall and Gordon Russell to kind of wrap their heads around the whole Lovecraft, Dunwich horror, eldritch beings who held sway over the earth before. And I thought it was cool. It was something really different.
The interesting thing is, though, there was sort of, amidst that sort of course correction midway through, they probably hit on what the Leviathan should have been all along. Because initially they are unambiguously aliens who are going to breed a new, and they're going to take over the world. Great. Off you go, guys. By the time we then get to sort of December 69, they are a cult and they're
Yeah.
described as a cult, and they're a cult that worships this alien. And I kind of wonder if this is all tied to the Manson family stuff, because the arrests
Oh,
happen
interesting.
around that time. And suddenly they're talking about, weird cults doing things. And,
Yeah.
I wonder in a sort of zeitgeisty way if that was sort of feeding into it somehow, because it
Yeah.
seems because it's such a specific word. It's not a word Dark Shadows had used before. It wasn't in the Dark Shadows lexicon before then. So yeah, there's something very odd about that. But
I-
possibly this idea that it's more like a kind of supernatural protection racket, which
yeah.
there's a sort of glimmer of with the stuff with Paul Stoddard, and that feels more like a sort of viable way you could plug all that into a soap.
Right. And I think bringing in Nicholas probably to put it into some sort of context, because I don't think I think people are having a difficult time understanding what the Leviathans were. So putting it,
Well, they've
bringing
got
in,
this sort of again is sort of it feels sort of like it's not correctly inputted. If it's like an almost an algebraic equation, it's not inputted correctly into the
yeah,
soap. Whereas ideally, you kind of want a leader and someone to talk to. It would make so much more sense if Megan and Philip have just moved to Collinsport, and being nice antique dealers is a front where
yeah,
they're actually Leviathan agents quite willingly, and
yeah,
you that's not what you call it, zealots
yeah, yes,
along, and you sort of play the wrinkle of them being sort of bland and suburban,
yeah,
and actually they're sort of,
yeah.
it's black candles behind curtains.
Right. And when we should clarify, when we talk about course correction and bending the knee, Stuart is referring to the emergency episode of the show.
So for context, the Leviathan story is kicking off at the end of 1969, and it's been going for some weeks, probably about 6 weeks, and it's not going terribly well. And then they get to December, and on Christmas Eve, so literally the last moment before the Christmas break, before you go into the new year, more or less, they record an emergency episode, which is inserted into the sequence. And there's already about 3 weeks of shows that have been banked and are going to air through through to January. So it's really an odd, unprecedented thing to do. Quite as a piece of sort of chicanery behind the scenes, quite high concept and quite ambitious, and it probably works better than it's got any right to. But it has sort of weird things like Michael Maitland comes back to play Michael, the sort of the Leviathan kid. He'd left the show. They were they were into, possibly, I'm not sure, I guess Chris Pennock must have started by then, but yeah, they got him back for a day, and they insert this show that is there, and it's reframing stuff, and don't believe what everyone's saying to you for the next 3 weeks because it all means something different. And it kind of, what's interesting about it is it breaks a contract. At least that's my thesis I put forward, was that it breaks a contract with the audience, and all soaps operate on that contract. And when you break the trust of your audience and you lose it, you don't get it back. And I think arguably, although as I say, it's a bit of a parlor game to make a point, but I think arguably it's a long climb back. It would have been a long climb back for Dark Shadows after that, I think.
And you point to this, listening to your audience, the pros and cons of that, because there were different audiences for Dark Shadows, right? I like talking about this sometimes on the podcast, because you have the soap opera fans, but you also have the horror fans, like the monster kids reading famous monsters of filmland. You have the 16 magazine Tiger Beat teeny bopper fans who are really into the actors, etc. You have the kind of the stoners in college, watching. So you have all these different audiences who all are perhaps interested in different aspects of the show. So I think listening too much to one particular group of people,
well, there's a sort of danger, isn't there, that the minute you sort of go down that road, the most vocal voices, in some ways, they're the audience that's most locked in. They're the ones who are most likely to watch come hell or high water. Now, perversely, they're also the ones who are most likely to complain.
Yeah.
Now, I put it to you, therefore, they're the ones you should listen to least. But I'm not a soap producer looking at the ratings chart, sort of falling downwards. So I can sort of understand it. And I think with Dark Shadows, it was very difficult because it was a very fragmented audience, which in some ways is what made the show interesting. I think it also made it somewhat unsustainable. And I think it made it, particularly with the teen audience, I think the things that people don't really consider is that massive summer in '69, it coincided with the school holidays. So
Yeah.
there was always going to be, you were always going to go into that story and have a slump ratings wise because the kids were going back to school.
Right.
So that no one really talks about that as a contributing factor, but it was clearly there. You also have the really you've got a sort of juvenile audience, which by its nature, they're quite faddish. They're also growing up really fast. So if you were sort of 15, should we say, and watching the show in '67, by the time it's going off the air, you're 19. And I know I'm not convinced there was necessarily a second wave of young viewers coming in. I think it was probably, and this is not unique to Dark Shadows. It's what happened with things like Batman and a lot of those sort of Irwin Allen shows. It's why they kind of tended to burn through 2 or 3 years and then, we're on the wane. And people did talk at the time about Dark Shadows being a fad show, which I think was true. I think it could have been engineered into something a bit more long term. I think arguably what they were doing in 71 Parallel Time, which is sort of making it into a show about somewhat through circumstance because lots of people are off making the movie. But for about 6 weeks, it's a show about attractive people with too much money making problems for themselves, which is really what soaps became in the 70s.
Right. And a haunted lottery room.
Yeah.
Just
with some supernatural stuff around the edges, but possibly that's what the show could have segued into. And I think it wasn't so much that none of these things would have worked, but I don't think there was anyone really grasping the nettle and saying, okay, this is what we're going to make this show. And we are probably going to lose some viewers in the process, but that's what you need to do. It can't be trying to be 4 or 5 different things for 4 or 5 different audiences in the present tense, which is, I think, kind of what happened. And it sort of happened. Weirdly, it sort of happens in '68, but they use that flashback to 1897 as a kind of very successful soft reboot.
Yeah.
And create a sort of more simplified, viable version of the show. Because although there is a sort of farcical, amusing aspect to just how crazy and kooky the tail end of '68 is, it's pretty. There's a lot of stuff that I think is objectively terrible.
Well, it just ends. It's just bye, Adam. See ya.
There's so much of that where there are just things where you can just tell people are just tearing out pages and calling it quits. So
although I did like the lead up. Well, after coming out of the way the Adam storyline wraps up is just kind of
the Adam Eve stuff.
It just implodes, and then but I like the Quentin's ghost and werewolf.
That stuff's definitely more successful for sure.
Yeah.
The bit that I think is possibly the single, well, depending on your mileage, it's either the single worst or best episode of Dark Shadows is the one where, and it is burn the house down, not quite literally, but almost, where they're going to revive Eve. And then she turns into a skeleton, and then Nicholas is chased to a cliff, and he bursts into flames for reasons I'm not quite sure. And it's got everything in the kitchen sink and nothing lands. It's terrible. But it's kind
except for Barnabas' chilling smile.
Exercise in excess, it is kind of entertaining and absurd and cherishable in its own way.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Every storyline in Dark Shadows, I always find something to love. The thing I wanted to ask, coming out of 1897, I had always heard these rumors about the idea that they pitched a mummy storyline, and I'd never found any verification of that until you mentioned that you had actually seen something to that effect. I don't know if it was
there is something in a fan letter, and who knows? I mean, it may have been something heard in a whisper at a studio door, or mistranscribed, or misunderstood. I mean, it certainly doesn't seem to have had any serious consideration.
I'm always curious about things that were potentially planned that never saw the light of day in the show, like storylines or story ideas that they were going to try to do.
And the interesting thing is with Dark Shadows, because there really wasn't a lot of planning. They're only working, they're 2 weeks ahead in script terms, and then a week and a half ahead in storylining terms, which again is not how soaps work. I mean, most soaps
Yeah.
3 months ahead at least, if not 6.
But just those writers' meetings with Dan Curtis, I can just imagine Dan Curtis with like Sam Hall and Gordon Russell and other writers, Violet Wells or Joel
They sound
Caldwell.
extraordinary. And what's really
I
clear is
would,
that
yeah,
whatever you thought the story was that morning, by the time you sort of stagger out to get the last train home, when it's all over, it's no longer that. And the show is doing something completely different. And again, I think you can watch the shows and I think sometimes you can tell it's about something different than it was 2 weeks ago. And that can, in some ways, that means there's never a dull moment. In other ways, it can sometimes mean there's just no connective tissue.
right.
And particularly for soaps, I think the status quo aspect is really important. And I think that's something that first year of the show really has and really benefits from. And I think you really miss it once it's gone in a sort of low frequency way. It's not like it suddenly becomes unwatchable, and often it's brilliant. But I think you never have that sort of sense of what the rules are of the community, who knows what about whom. Everything, the world becomes literally smaller. You or I can walk back to Collinwood or to the Blue Whale, and it takes 5 seconds. In the early days, it's an event when those worlds cross.
Yeah.
And they never quite regain that, and it's never quite as, I don't think that creatively, I don't think it's ever quite as pure again.
Right. Yeah. Good observation there, Stuart. Although you could say the trade-off is that the show becomes more exciting and unpredictable. Speaking of exciting, what can we? You've dropped a few hints about issue 2, and any more that you care to drop, or contributors, or is it a mystery?
We've got quite a lot of people who contributed to the first issue contributing again, which is nice. We have. There's a feature from you, which you should know.
Really? What?
As you've written it, which is about merchandise. And I think we've got kind of an interesting visual treatment that will look at merchandise in a slightly different way, which will be hopefully quite charming. There's something, you've had Steve Shutt on your...
Yeah, I know Steve.
Yeah.
He's a friend. Yeah.
So Steve, many years ago, I think I worked it out, it's 26 years ago, wrote something for the old fanzine that never got used. And I remembered this piece, and I remember thinking it was the best thing. It was a really great piece. It was the best thing that never got published, and I felt a bit bad about it. And I went to him and I said, I remember this piece you wrote, and do you remember it? Could you be, because obviously we're talking over a quarter of a century. I said, would you be interested in revisiting? He said, no, I've got it. And obviously, we've bounced it about a little bit, the idea of it, and I wouldn't hold him to his opinions, however earnest or heartfelt, from that long ago, but he's going to revisit that. So that feels like it's righting a little cosmic wrong.
Right.
What else have we got? We have, what can I tell you? I think there's going to be another comic strip, I hope.
Right.
And,
cool.
It's not being written by me, it's by someone else. And I think that someone is really interesting. And I hope they have time to do it. They say they have, and they've never let me down before. So fingers crossed. And Mark Perry's going to write another piece, which I think is quite an interesting... I think is a sort of interesting aspect of Dark Shadows that I think he's going to have some good opinions on, or some, some opinions that will be interesting to read for sure. And yeah, we're doing. Jim Pearson and I have been discussing a sort of historical research, sort of deep dive piece that. Credit to Jim. He came actually very late in the day when the issue was being finished and had found this. The previous issue, sorry, and I found this requisition doc for the way the crew was broken down. It's just and it was just kind of interesting. And I sort of said to him, "Well, that is interesting, but no human being can make head nor tail of it. Can you help me caption it or something?" And actually, Jim got really interested in it, so he interviewed Michael Brockman, who was the unit manager on the show, and is sort of a grand old age, but. Still active and kind of compos mentis. And so they went through this thing in some detail. Yeah. And Jim wrote a really good piece that again was had lots of information I didn't know about. And it was
awesome. It was great. Yeah.
And that was really nice. And so, yeah, we've been talking about something else that's an aspect of Dark Shadows production that I feel has been glossed over. And when I put it to him, he agrees it's been glossed over, and I think it's gonna be another sort of collaboration with Michael, and possibly we'll see maybe some other people. for insights. But yeah, that'll be fun, I think. I'm quite interested. I'm interested to see what he finds out.
Oh, that'll be great. Yeah, I'm really excited about that. Very, very cool.
But yeah, in essence, it's going to be, I don't think, too different from the previous issue. It's going to be the same basic format. It'll be two different, horribly clashing colors throughout. It will be probably, we're going to try and make it a bit longer. The last one ended up being 130 pages. And we might I think we can probably nudge this maybe 10 or so more without breaking the post barrier. So it'd be nice to fill it out a little more if there's the material, which I think there will be. So yeah, the more the merrier.
And I hope fans will be patient because I did see there were some fans who were complaining that about delays, and like, this is a charity zine that Stuart is doing on his own time, in his free time. He was a full-time job doing graphic design, so this is something that he's labor of love kind of thing. So as you saw with the first issue, it did come eventually. So please, patience.
I mean, it's interesting that I think there is a bit of, maybe I was a bit naive about it. I think there was a little bit of re-education almost required about what a fanzine is and how it operates. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's just been a while and people just, had sort of forgotten that or didn't know it to begin with. But, we're...
Gosh, it would take, it was exciting when we'd
it was a sort of big undertaking, and that's not me sort of bearing the cross. There was a lot of people put an awful lot of work into it, and hopefully the reason why it was special is or why people found it special. We're not going to tell you it was, but everyone did try really hard to sort of make it the best it could be, and that takes time, and hopefully we'll do the same again and we can make it a little bit better besides. I'm
really looking forward to it. And again, Stuart is still looking for submissions. You still have time as of this recording. We're in October 2023, so this will probably be going out in about a week. And you still have some time to submit your pitch to Stuart, especially if you have fan art and fan fiction. I'll put a link in the show notes to the submission form or to the email. Can you say the email again, please, Stuart?
Yeah, it's collinwood80@gmail.com.
Cool. Oh, let me ask you this. Is there any chance that you will do a third printing of issue 1, or is issue 1
Well, it's kind of, I think probably not, because we need to do it. Yeah, it's a minimum of 100, which is which was what the second printing was. And that was, they did sell, but there is sort of, there's issues of space. It's space and just admin and things like that. So probably not. But then again, if you'd have, if you'd asked me a year ago, I'd have said there wouldn't have been an issue 2, and there probably wouldn't have been a reprint of issue 1. So who knows? Maybe one day. But yeah, it's probably not practical.
Okay. Well, instead of looking for reprint, we can look forward to issue 3. But let's talk about that later.
It's a life sentence now. Oh, I see. That's not shadows.
Yeah. What is it from a Godfather? You try to get out, but they keep pulling you back in. All right, Stuart. Well, thank you so much for joining me again and visiting with me here at Terror at Collinwood, and definitely very excited about issue 2 of Daytime Gothic. All right, folks, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time. And for as long as they lived, the dark shadows never truly vanished, for there will always be terror at Collinwood. Terror at Collinwood is a Penny Dreadful production.